I used to think money could fix anything, that if you gave enough, loved enough, sacrificed enough, the people you called family would never turn on you. I was wrong. It cost me $100,000 to learn that lesson. Tonight, the Lakeshore Grand glowed like a diamond against the dark. My name wasn't on the invitation, but every flicker of candlelight, every crystal, every song playing inside, that was me. My work, my gift, my mistake. I'd planned it all for my sister's perfect day. A dream wedding dripping in luxury, paid for with my savings, and a heart too stubborn to stop believing. I told myself it was worth it, that seeing her happy would make the hollow inside me smaller. But as I stood outside the ballroom, watching the guests pour in something, inside my chest twisted. There was laughter, the clinking of glasses, and a kind of joy that didn't sound right. Then I heard his voice, deep familiar, the one that used to whisper my name, like it meant something. My breath caught before I even saw him. The man at the altar, smiling like the world had always been kind to him, wasn't supposed to be here. Not with her. Not like this. The crowd rose, the music swelled, and suddenly the lights inside the ballroom burned brighter than I could stand. I thought I knew how this night would end. I didn't. The ballroom at the Lakeshore Grand shimmered like something out of a dream, the kind of dream that costs 6 figures and leaves no room for mistakes. Crystal chandeliers floated above rows of champagne glasses and hydrangeas as white as the dress my sister was about to wear. I stood near the back headset, still around my neck, even though my work was technically done. Every corner glowed, just as I planned it. The scent of gardenias and candle wax filled the air. It was perfect. Sophie had always been the kind of person perfection followed. When she walked through the door, people looked up. Tonight was no different. Her gown caught the light like 1,000 tiny stars, and the crowd turned as if choreographed. My parents stood proudly near the stage, their smiles rehearsed and camera ready. I should have felt joy. I had spent 3 months planning every flower, every plate, every song. $100,000. My money, my design, my gift. When the band began to play Sinatra, my father took the microphone. His voice was warm and heavy with pride. "We're so proud of our only daughter," he said. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. The applause that followed was so loud it drowned out the soft gasp that escaped my throat. My mother's hand rested on his arm. She was smiling toward Sophie, radiant, graceful, as if the words were gospel. I stood frozen among strangers, the champagne flute trembling in my hand until the bubbles went flat. Someone nearby laughed. Someone else whispered, asking who I was. My mother's eyes met mine for half a second, cool and careful, then drifted away. The orchestra swelled. Sophie twirled beneath the chandelier's veil, glinting like a halo. For a family built on appearances, it was the perfect picture. Except for the missing daughter, standing alone near the bar. I slipped out before anyone noticed heels clicking against marble floors that seemed to stretch forever. Outside, the night was colder than I expected, sharp with sea salt from the Maine coast. The fireworks were ready on the bluff, waiting for the countdown to midnight. I could hear the laughter echoing from inside, layered with the faint rhythm of jazz. I stopped by the stone railing overlooking the ocean. The waves folded over each other in silver curls under the moonlight. I tried to breathe, to let the salt air clear my chest, but the weight in it only grew heavier. 4 years ago, Ethan had stood beside me on another night like this, promising forever. We had been engaged for 6 months when he disappeared, leaving nothing but an unanswered ring box and a text that said, "I'm sorry, I can't." I never knew what happened, only that he moved away and I built a new life without looking back. Until tonight. A vibration buzzed in my clutch. My phone lit up with a notification from the bank. Payment confirmed. Transfer of $100,000 completed. Recipient Sophie and Ethan Cross. The world tilted. The name burned on the screen as if it were carved there. Ethan Cross. I whispered it once, tasting the old wound like metal on my tongue. The man who broke my heart was now my sister's husband, and I had just paid for the wedding. A waiter brushed past, asking if I wanted another drink. I shook my head, unable to answer. The glass slipped from my fingers and shattered on the flagstone champagne, spreading across the ground like spilled gold. The sound drew a few curious glances through the window, but no one came outside. Inside the ballroom, my family raised their glasses again. Through the glass doors, I could see my mother laugh at something Ethan said. He looked the same, a little older, a little more polished, wearing the confident smile that once belonged to me. Sophie leaned into him, glowing under the chandelier light. They looked like the perfect couple. I turned away, the cold biting into my skin. Somewhere down the path, a violin began its solo notes, floating into the night like ghosts. My pulse slowed. The salt wind tangled my hair, and for a moment, I wished I could disappear with it, vanish, before anyone remembered I existed. But I wasn't gone. I was still the woman who had made this night possible. The one who had written the checks, chosen the flowers, arranged the seating chart. The one who thought family meant loyalty. The ocean roared louder than the music now. I watched as the first fireworks shot into the sky, exploding into gold and white above the cliff. The guests inside cheered. Their laughter carried across the water like celebration and mockery all at once. I whispered a quiet congratulations that no one would hear. Then I slipped off my heels and walked down the stone path toward the parking lot, my bare feet leaving faint marks on the cold gravel. Each step echoed in the dark, steady, deliberate. In the car, I sat for a long time before turning the key. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked unfamiliar. Mascara streaked down my cheeks, hair coming loose from its bun. I didn't look like a sister or a daughter. I looked like a stranger who had stayed too long at someone else's celebration. The dashboard clock flicked to 11:58. Inside, the countdown had begun. I could almost hear them chanting 10, 9, 8. I imagined Sophie's laughter, Ethan's hand on her waist, my mother's perfect smile. When the fireworks finally burst overhead, lighting up the windshield in gold, I whispered to no one, "Happy New Year, Sophie." "Happy marriage, Ethan." The sky exploded again, brighter this time. I started the engine. The headlights cut through the mist curling along the coastal road. Behind me, the music faded into the distance until it was only a hum beneath the sound of the sea. I drove away from the light, past the cliffs, and the glittering resort toward the dark stretch of highway leading back to Boston. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. The silence in the car felt like a promise forming in my chest, sharp and certain. They had erased me in front of everyone. But they had no idea what they had just set in motion. By the time I reached Boston, the sky had already started to pale, the kind of gray that hangs between night and morning. My apartment felt colder than usual when I walked in. The silence there was different from the silence in the car. This one had edges sharper, as if the walls themselves were asking what I had just witnessed. I left my suitcase by the door and stood in the dark for a while, still wearing the same dress that smelled of champagne and salt air. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face under the chandeliers, his hand resting on Sophie's back. The image repeated until it felt less like memory and more like a punishment. By 7, I gave up trying to rest and called my mother. She answered on the second ring, voice already dressed in politeness. "You made quite an exit last night," she said. I waited a beat. "I had to get some air, Mom." Her sigh crackled through the line. "Clara, it was your sister's big day. I know it must have been difficult, but life moves on. You should be happy for her." Happy. The word hung there like a dare. I wanted to tell her what I'd seen on the screen, what name had burned through me like acid, but I swallowed it. I just asked quietly, "Did you know?" She hesitated only for a second, but enough. Then she said, "Of course not. You think I'd let something like that surprise you? Don't make this into something ugly." Sophie deserves peace. Peace. Another word that didn't belong to me. I ended the call before I said something I couldn't take back. Around noon, I drove to the hotel to settle the final vendor payments. The lobby was half empty, still smelling faintly of roses and melted wax. I found Sophie near the front desk, radiant even in her travel clothes, a cream sweater and oversized sunglasses perched in her hair. Ethan stood beside her, phone in hand, giving instructions to someone about a meeting in Manhattan. CEO tone sharp and controlled. When Sophie saw me, her smile flickered. "I didn't expect you to come," she said. "Someone had to close the accounts," I replied. Ethan finally looked up. His expression barely changed, just the faintest curve of surprise, before the practiced calm returned. "Clara, it's been a while." "4 years," I said. He nodded as if it were nothing more than a scheduling error. "Past is past," he said. "We've both moved on." Sophie slipped her arm through his. "You should learn to let things go," she said softly, almost sweetly, but there was something else in her tone. Triumph. The words landed harder than I wanted them to. My hands clenched around the folder I was holding. I told her I'd email the receipts and walked away before my voice betrayed me. Back in my car, I opened my laptop to finalize the vendor file. Something felt wrong. The master contract, the one I'd signed to book the venue, now listed a new signature line, authorized by Sophie Cross. I stared at it, scrolling through the digital timestamp. 2 days before the wedding. My name was gone. I called the event coordinator. She sounded apologetic but firm. "Mrs. Cross requested the update herself," she said. "She had your authorization." "No, I didn't," I said. "I never gave permission for that." She hesitated. "The document had a verified signature from your account." I ended the call, pulse hammering. My signature wasn't mine anymore. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, scrolling through my bank portal. Transfers, payments, receipts. I had memorized the numbers when I planned the wedding, but one line glared back at me now. An automatic withdrawal I hadn't approved. Funds routed to a new joint account under Sophie and Ethan Cross. I called the bank, heart thudding. After a series of holds and transfers, a calm voice finally said, "Yes, Miss Mitchell, we do have a digital authorization from your account. Time-stamped December 20th. "That's impossible," I said. "I didn't sign anything." The representative paused. "The authorization was processed using your personal PIN and security code." I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like it was mocking me. "Could someone have accessed my profile?" He hesitated again, lower this time. "It appears the login originated from your home network in Boston." I thanked him mechanically and hung up. The city lights outside my window blurred into a smear of gold and blue. Inside, everything was still. I tried to remember where I was on December 20th. I had been in my apartment planning table arrangements, maybe emailing vendors. Alone. Always alone. The next morning, I went to the downtown branch in person. The lobby smelled like polished wood and security. A young banker led me to a small glass office, his polite smile fixed in place. I handed him my ID, my printed statements, my trembling patience. He disappeared for 10 minutes, then returned with a file and a careful tone. "The authorization matches your digital credentials," he said. "Same devices, same location. So someone forged it." He nodded slightly, lowering his voice. "We see this sometimes. Family members, business partners, shared networks. If you'd like, we can flag the account for fraud investigation, but that might freeze your funds for several weeks." Family members. The phrase burned. I asked for a copy of the authorization document. When he handed it over, I stared at the signature. My name looping and neat, perfectly mimicking the one on my driver's license. Only it wasn't mine. Outside Boston buzzed in its usual rhythm. Coffee carts, car horns, people moving with purpose. I stood on the sidewalk holding the folder, feeling as though the ground beneath me had tilted. The air smelled like rain and exhaust, too familiar to be comforting. At home, I spread the documents across my dining table. My name appeared on every page that mattered, tied to accounts, payments, and contracts. But my hands had never touched them. Somewhere between generosity and trust, I had handed over pieces of myself, and now they were being used like currency. As the evening light faded, I scrolled through photos from the wedding. My mother smiling, Sophie laughing, Ethan's hand resting on her waist. Every image looked like a celebration, but all I could see was a cover story. I closed the laptop and stared at the dark window. My reflection looked hollow, like someone mid-erasure. Maybe they just wanted to humiliate me, I thought. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Humiliation fades. This felt deliberate, planned. There was something else buried beneath the glitter and the vows, something that smelled like deceit and paperwork. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere along the harbor road. I listened until it faded, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. Whatever they were hiding, they'd made one mistake. They thought I would stay silent. The next morning, I woke to gray light seeping through the blinds and a pounding in my chest that had nothing to do with caffeine or lack of sleep. I made coffee anyway, letting the noise of the machine fill the apartment, then opened my laptop again. I wanted proof, something I could hold in my hands. The account transfers were still there, clean and irreversible. As I scrolled, another notification appeared, a new message from the family bank server, subject line finalized, transfer property title, 42 Lighthouse Road. For a second I thought it was spam. Then I saw the address. The house where I grew up. The message wasn't even addressed to me. My name sat in the CC line, probably an old system habit. The email was short, efficient, and devastating. Beneficiary Sophie Cross. Effective date December 31st. Attached were notarized documents. I clicked them open with shaking hands. Each signature was perfectly aligned. My father's careful loops, my mother's neat cursive, and Sophie's new name written like she was signing a fairy tale. My name was nowhere. For a moment I couldn't move. The screen blurred and the smell of coffee burned. Lighthouse Road wasn't just a house. It was the place my father built with his own hands, the one he promised would belong to both of us someday. I had helped pay the mortgage for years when his business struggled wiring money every month without question. I used to believe that loyalty meant safety. Now it just felt like a joke. By noon I was in my car heading north toward Camden. The highway looked endless salt mist clinging to the trees along the coast. When I pulled up in front of the old house, it looked smaller, as if time itself had shrunk it. The same white siding, the same porch swing, but now a new sign hung near the gate engraved with the words, Cross Residence. My stomach turned. My father opened the door before I could knock. He wore his plaid robe, eyes tired, surprise flickering when he saw me. "Clara," he said softly, "what are you doing here?" I held up my phone, the email still glowing on the screen. "Want to explain this?" He rubbed his forehead, voice low. "Let's not do this here. Come inside." Inside, the smell of lemon cleaner mixed with leftover champagne. Gift bags cluttered the dining table, wedding ribbons draped over chairs. Everything looked staged, like a museum of a family that no longer existed. My mother appeared in the doorway, still immaculate, lipstick fresh, her tone rehearsed. "Clara, you should have called first. I figured you might hang up," I said. She sighed, almost patient. "You're upset. I understand, but it isn't as dramatic as you think." "Not dramatic," I said. "You stood at a wedding and called me invisible, and now you've signed away the house I helped pay for." Her expression didn't flinch. "You don't have children." "Sophie does. She needed stability. You're fine on your own." "Fine," I repeated, laughing once. "That's what you call it. Fine is what you say to someone you've already written off." My father tried to interject, but the words tangled in his throat. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly. My mother's face softened in the way she did when she was about to end an argument. "Families change," she said. "We did what we thought was best. For who, I asked? For the family or for Sophie's brand?" She turned away. The conversation was over for her. I walked out before I broke something. Outside, the air hit cold against my face. I stood on the gravel driveway, staring at the porch swing my father built when I was 10. The same swing where he once told me, "You and Sophie will always share this place." The lie stung more than the wind. I didn't plan to see anyone else, but a car pulled in just as I reached mine. Sophie stepped out, her hair pulled back, a diamond catching the sunlight. She looked startled. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "Visiting what used to be my home," I said. Her smile faltered. "I heard." She looked down, twisting her ring. "Mom said you'd take it the wrong way. Is there a right way to steal from your sister?" She flinched. "It's not like that. You're always so busy. You don't even live here." I stared at her, the calm slipping from my voice. "You could have told me." She hesitated. I didn't know how. You say that a lot when it's convenient, I said. She blinked fast, eyes shiny. I didn't ask for this. No, I said, but you didn't refuse it either. I got in my car before the anger spilled over. In the mirror, I saw her still standing there, hands pressed together like prayer or guilt. The drive back to Boston felt longer. My phone buzzed several times, but I didn't look until I parked outside my apartment. A new message sat at the top of my inbox. From Daniel Sullivan. Subject, Mitchell Interiors. Urgent. Daniel had been my parents' attorney years ago, the one who helped them restructure their company when business went south. I hadn't spoken to him since. His message was short. Need to discuss something regarding your name on the corporate records. Call me as soon as possible. I dialed immediately. He answered with that same steady voice I remembered. Clara, thank you for calling. I'm afraid there's been a situation. What kind of situation? He cleared his throat. Your sister and her husband have been moving assets between Cross Development and Mitchell Interiors. To finalize the merger, they used your accounts to demonstrate liquidity. My pulse quickened. My accounts? Yes, he said. They listed you as a financial guarantor. According to the paperwork, your funds served as collateral. I gripped the phone tighter. I didn't agree to any merger. I know, Daniel said quietly. That's why I wanted to reach out before things escalate. We need to verify what's been filed. So they used my money to make it look like the company was solvent. That's one way to put it, he said. Clara, I think this goes deeper. There are documents signed under your name, digital copies. Whoever did this had access to personal identification that matches your records. I closed my eyes, nausea rising. This isn't just betrayal, I said. It's fraud. Daniel paused. I can start an inquiry discreetly. For now, don't confront them again. Let me see what I can uncover. When the call ended, I sat at the table staring at the city lights flickering through the window. The hum of traffic below blended with the sound of my own heartbeat. Somewhere between family and business, they had rewritten me into a line item. Later that night, I opened my old email threads with my mother, hundreds of messages full of advice and affection. Reading them now felt like scanning evidence. Every word that once felt warm had turned into a warning I never recognized. I scrolled until the last message. It was dated 2 months before the wedding. Her words were simple. Trust me, Clara. This will secure the family's future. I shut the laptop, the phrase echoing like static. For the first time, I understood what she meant. She hadn't been securing the family's future. She'd been erasing mine. I didn't sleep that night. The phrase kept circling in my mind until it scraped everything raw. Secure the family's future. I stared at the ceiling until the shadows shifted from black to blue, then packed a bag and drove back to Camden before I could talk myself out of it. The town was waking up when I pulled onto Lighthouse Road. The house looked quiet, blinds drawn, sunlight catching on the porch swing my father once painted white. I had promised Daniel I wouldn't confront them yet, but silence felt like another way of surrender. My mother opened the door as if she had been expecting me. Her robe was silk, her hair pinned perfectly, no trace of surprise in her eyes. Clara, she said with that practiced calm. Come in, you look tired. I stepped inside. The air smelled of coffee and polished wood. My father sat at the dining table, glasses perched on his nose, pretending to read the newspaper. When he looked up, his eyes darted away too quickly. I placed my phone on the table and said quietly, I saw the deed. The transfer wasn't a mistake. My mother's smile didn't falter. You're an independent woman, she said. You have your own life, your work. Sophie has a family to think about. It made sense. Made sense for who I asked. For her. For you. Robert folded the newspaper, his hands trembling slightly. You won't understand, he said. Things were complicated. Try me, I said. He shook his head, voice barely above a whisper. Your mother thought it was the right thing. I turned to her. The right thing. You called me your daughter in every holiday card, and now I'm an afterthought on a spreadsheet. She set her cup down gently, her tone clipped. Watch your words, Clara. We did what we had to do. Sophie appeared in the doorway, then eyes puffy, makeup smudged, like she had been crying. She looked at me, voice shaking. "You always think you're better than me." "They needed me, Clara. They needed someone to keep the family name clean." I laughed, a short sound that didn't feel like me. "So you sold me to keep your name polished?" Sophie flinched. "That's not fair. Nothing about this is fair." The room felt small, the air heavy with the smell of bitterness and brewed coffee. My father muttered something I couldn't catch, and my mother's voice rose just enough to fill the silence. "We built everything we have from nothing, Clara. You should be grateful for what I asked, for being erased." Her jaw tightened. "Don't dramatize. Families change. We adapt." I reached into my purse, pressed record on my phone, and set it on the table. Her words kept flowing, calm, confident, the kind of tone that always convinced outsiders she was right. I didn't interrupt. I just let her voice fill the room, every excuse recorded with perfect clarity. When I finally picked up the phone, I said, "I think that's enough adapting for today." Then I left, before they could respond. Outside, the sky had turned the color of pewter. I sat in my car for a long moment, breathing through the rush of adrenaline that came after holding my ground. For once, I didn't cry. I was too tired for that. As I started the engine, I saw Sophie through the window, standing behind the curtain, with her phone raised, recording me. Her face was unreadable. I told myself it didn't matter, but a part of me knew it did. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Dozens of missed calls, texts, notifications piling in faster than I could swipe them away. My name was trending locally. A video 20 seconds long had surfaced online. The clip showed me standing in my parents' living room, voice raised, saying, "I'll make sure everything you've built falls apart." The rest of the conversation was gone, trimmed, to make me sound unhinged. The comments were brutal. People called me bitter, jealous, pathetic. A local blog picked it up with the headline, "Jealous Sister Ruins $1 Million Wedding." I dropped the phone onto the table, the screen still lighting up with new alerts. The recording Sophie had taken wasn't just personal humiliation. It was strategy. They had turned me into the villain before I even knew the story had begun. That afternoon, my assistant called from the office in Boston. She sounded nervous. "Clara, I think you should check the company's social media. Clients are asking questions. Someone leaked the story to the press." By evening, 2 event sponsors had canceled contracts. A journalist emailed requesting comment. The damage was spreading faster than I could contain it. I stood by the window, watching rain streak down the glass. My reflection looked fractured, doubled by the droplets. I had spent years perfecting my reputation, building a career on reliability and grace under pressure. Now it was collapsing under the weight of one edited video. I wanted to call Sophie, to scream, to demand she take it down. But then I imagined her face, that same composed innocence she used when she wanted something. She would deny it, twist it, maybe even cry. And the world would believe her. They always did. The phone buzzed again. Daniel's name lit up on the screen. I answered without speaking. "Clara," he said carefully, "I saw the news. Don't respond publicly. Not yet. They're trying to bait you." "They already won," I said. "No, they just changed the field. Now you decide how the next move looks." His voice was steady, and for the first time all day, something inside me steadied too. After we hung up, I sat in the dark, scrolling through the comments one last time. Each word cut deeper, but I forced myself to read them until they blurred into noise. I thought of my mother's composure, my father's silence, Sophie's tears, masks, all of them polished and worn so long they'd forgotten what honesty looked like. When I finally closed my laptop, the apartment felt too quiet again. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of it, heavy and clean. I leaned against the window, my fingers tracing the glass, and whispered to myself, "This isn't about family anymore." It wasn't grief now. It was war. By the end of that week, my phone had gone quiet for all the wrong reasons. Clients who used to send me flowers after every successful event were now canceling meetings without explanation. 2 major contracts dissolved overnight. The polite rejections all sounded the same: timing issues, shifting budgets, brand reputation concerns. I didn't need anyone to spell it out. My name was Poison. The video had done its job. On the morning my assistant quit, she left a single note on my desk that read, "I'm sorry. I can't afford to lose my next job." I sat staring at it until the letters blurred. The office that used to hum with calls and music now felt like a shell. I packed a few folders into a box and left before noon. Back at my apartment, the news made things worse. Sophie and Ethan's faces filled a glossy magazine spread I hadn't asked to see. The headline called them the new power couple of the Northeast. I flipped through the pages past photos of them smiling beside luxury furniture and charity galas. Ethan looked every bit the polished businessman. Sophie wore a fitted white suit, her hand resting on his arm, as if it had always belonged there. The article praised their merger between Cross Development and Mitchell Interiors, calling it a family-driven success story. I laughed out loud, the sound bitter and sharp. That night Daniel called. His voice was steady but urgent. "Clara, there's something you need to hear." I grabbed a notepad. "Ethan's company is under review. IRS flagged multiple inconsistencies tied to construction contracts. He's been using loans under Mitchell Interior's name." My stomach dropped. "So he's laundering money." "That's the suspicion," Daniel said. "But we'll need proof." I opened my laptop, searching through the folder of bank statements I'd downloaded weeks ago. As the lines of numbers scrolled by, something caught my eye. A single transfer from December, $15,000 to a name I didn't recognize. Victor Langford. The memo read, "Notary Services." I circled it. I remembered that name from somewhere. Daniel went quiet for a moment, then said Langford's under investigation for forgery. He's known for notarizing fake corporate documents. "So they paid him," I said, "to make everything look legal." "It fits," Daniel replied. "If we can connect that payment to Ethan's merger filings, this goes from family betrayal to federal crime." We agreed to meet the next day in a quiet diner near the courthouse. Daniel arrived with a folder full of documents. His tie loosened, his coffee untouched. He slid the folder toward me. Inside were copies of filings showing my name listed as a guarantor on company loans worth nearly $500,000. "They used you as collateral," Daniel said. "Your personal accounts made their merger appear stable." I stared at the papers, anger rising like heat under my skin. I wasn't just erased, I was their foundation. He nodded. "We'll forward everything to the IRS, but it has to stay quiet until they verify the data. If they catch wind too early, they'll bury evidence or move funds offshore." The waitress brought 2 refills of coffee. I took mine, black, bitter enough to keep me awake. When Daniel left, I stayed for a while, replaying every memory of Ethan shaking my father's hand, my mother's approving smile, Sophie's voice calling me too practical for family politics. The next evening, I came home to an envelope slid under my door. No return address. I assumed it was another late bill until I saw the writing on the front. My name in block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature. "Stop digging, or you'll be next to disappear." For a long moment, I just stared at it. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. I read it again, slower this time. My hands didn't shake. Fear didn't come the way I expected. Instead, something colder did, something like resolve. I took the note to Daniel the next morning. He read it and frowned. "They're trying to intimidate you. Don't let them. This means we're close." I watched rain slide down his office window. It hit the glass in soft streaks running together into blurred lines. Outside, Boston was wrapped in fog. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks. "If they want silence," I said quietly, "I'll be the one who speaks." Daniel studied me, then nodded once. "In that case, we'll use their own arrogance. Your mother is planning some kind of reconciliation dinner, right?" "She invited me," I said. Her exact words were, "Family should stay united for the press." "Perfect," Daniel said. "Let's make it her stage. You'll go. Act civil. Let Ethan brag. We'll wire you with a recorder. The IRS will monitor in real time. If he slips, they'll have him." I hesitated. My family, my home, my entire life would be on display. "Are you sure it will work?" "It already is," he said. People like Ethan always want to hear themselves talk. He'll hand you the confession without realizing it. That night I walked along the harbor, wind tearing through my hair. The lights on the water flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. Somewhere behind me, the city kept moving, oblivious to the quiet war unfolding inside a single woman. I thought of my father's voice saying families adapt, my mother's calculated calm, Sophie's flawless smile in magazines. They built everything on silence, I whispered to the wind. But silence has an echo, and I'm done being theirs. The next morning, the invitation arrived from my mother. A dinner at the house Friday evening. Family only. Her handwriting was elegant as ever, as if this were just another holiday gathering. I folded the card and slipped it into my coat pocket. Friday then. The storm would begin at their table. Friday arrived with a sky the color of steel and a wind that carried salt from the harbor. I drove to the house on Lighthouse Road with the same feeling I used to have before a major event, that nervous calm before the lights came on. Except this time, I wasn't there to make things beautiful. I was there to end the show. Daniel had met me that morning at a cafe downtown, sliding a small recording device across the table. "It's simple," he said. "Clip it to your dress and let them talk. They always do." By the time I reached the driveway, the sun was gone, and the house glowed with soft amber light. Cars lined the street more than I expected. Through the windows I saw waiters moving in crisp uniforms, silver trays glinting under chandeliers. My mother never did anything halfway. So this wasn't just a family dinner. It was a performance. Inside, the smell of roasted lamb and wine wrapped around me. My mother appeared first, immaculate as ever in a navy gown, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Clara, you made it," she said warmly, kissing the air beside my cheek. "Let's have no drama tonight, all right? For the family." I smiled. Of course, for the family. Sophie and Ethan stood near the piano, surrounded by a few unfamiliar faces. One of them I recognized from a local magazine, a columnist known for covering business events. Another man I'd seen at one of Ethan's charity galas. Investors, journalists, allies. My mother had turned reconciliation into a press opportunity. Ethan spotted me and raised a glass. "Clara, glad you could join us. We were just talking about the merger. Business couldn't be better." Sophie laughed lightly, almost on cue. I forced a polite smile. "That's great. It must feel good to see your profits double so quickly." Ethan grinned. "Hard work pays off. Of course I couldn't have done it without Sophie. She's been amazing." I took a slow sip of wine. "And my accounts," I said quietly. "They helped too, didn't they?" The conversation around us froze. Ethan's grin faltered for half a second before he recovered. "I'm not sure what you mean." My mother appeared beside me, her hand on my arm. "Clara, let's not bring up money tonight. This is about family. Family." That word again polished until it lost all meaning. I nodded and stepped back, pretending to admire the flower arrangements, pretending not to feel the recorder warm against my skin. Dinner was served in the formal dining room. The table glittered with crystal and silver. My father sat at the head, quieter than I remembered him ever being. His shoulders slumped, eyes dull behind his glasses. The room hummed with conversation until Ethan began to speak again, his voice carrying easily. "We're on track to triple our quarterly returns," he said, cutting into his steak. "The merger gave us leverage we never had before. I have to thank my incredible wife for that." I waited until the laughter subsided, so the forged documents were worth it then. Forks clinked against plates. Sophie's head snapped toward me, eyes wide. "Clara, what are you talking about?" I tilted my head, meeting Ethan's gaze. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The notary, the false filings, the fake authorizations, the ones that used my name." My mother's voice cut sharply through the air. "Enough! We won't have this discussion at the table." I stayed calm. Of course not. Wouldn't want to ruin the appetite. The tension spread like a ripple. No one spoke for a long time. Then Ethan stood, glass in hand, forcing a smile for the onlookers. "Let's not sour the evening. To new beginnings, to family, to success." He raised his glass high. Sophie followed her hand, trembling slightly. My father reached for his wine, hesitating. I looked toward the doorway, where a shadow flickered briefly. And then the front door opened. Voices filled the hall, clear, commanding. IRS agents. 2 uniformed officers. Behind them, Daniel appeared, suit, crisp eyes steady. The words came like thunder. Ethan Cross, you are under arrest for fraud falsifying federal documents and conspiracy to commit tax evasion. For a second, no one moved. Then chaos. One of the journalists gasped. Another began snapping photos before someone shouted to stop. Sophie clutched Ethan's arm, demanding to know what was happening. My mother's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. My father rose halfway, then crumpled back into his chair, his face drained of color. Ethan tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "This is a mistake." He looked at me, fury flashing beneath panic. "You did this!" I didn't answer. I just watched as the officers cuffed him. His suit wrinkled, his perfect mask cracking for the first time. My mother swayed her hand, gripping the back of a chair. Someone shouted her name, but she didn't respond. Her knees buckled, and 2 guests rushed to catch her. The room spun with noise, phones ringing, whispers colliding. Then came another sound, a soft thud. My father clutched his chest, his eyes wide, breath shallow. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Then everything blurred into movement. Someone called for an ambulance. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I tried to steady him. "Dad, stay with me." He looked up at me, eyes glassy. I told him to breathe, but his voice came out thin and broken. "Clara, listen. Your mother, she started it." Then his hand slipped from mine. The paramedics arrived within minutes, the air thick with sirens and the smell of spilt wine. They lifted him onto a stretcher, his face pale against the linen. I followed them outside, the night air, biting cold cameras flashing like lightning. At the hospital, I sat in the corridor, still in my dress, still hearing his last words on repeat. My mother was unconscious in another room. Sophie sat in a chair down the hall, crying into her hands. Daniel arrived an hour later, his expression a mixture of relief and pity. "It's done," he said quietly. "Ethan's in custody. The evidence was enough." I nodded, staring at the white tile floor. "You did it, Clara. You won." I looked up at him. The words tasted bitter. "Then why does it feel like I lost everything?" He didn't answer. The machines beeped steadily in the next room, a rhythm I couldn't shake. Daniel finally said, "There's always a cost." When he left, I went to my father's bedside. He was awake, but weak tubes running from his arms, his breath shallow. I took his hand and waited. After a while, his lips moved again. "Your mother," he whispered. "She's the one who began it all." His eyes closed. I sat there long after the nurses asked me to go, the sound of sirens still echoing in my head, the truth settling heavy in my chest, like the calm that comes after destruction. When I finally left the hospital, the night outside felt hollow. The streetlights cast long, pale shadows across the parking lot, the kind that make everything look temporary. I sat in the car for a long time, engine running, watching the rain start again in thin silver lines. My father's last words kept circling in my head. My mother started it. The phrase didn't make sense at first, then it began to. He hadn't been warning me about love or pride. He was pointing me toward something hidden, something unfinished. The next morning, I went to the workshop behind our old house, the one my father had used for decades to build furniture and forget arguments. The smell of sawdust and oil was still there, faint but familiar. His tools were lined up neatly, even though he hadn't touched them in months. I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw the old safe bolted under the workbench. It was scratched, rusted at the edges, the kind he never let anyone open. I found the key taped behind a wooden frame on the wall, exactly where he used to hide the Christmas presents when we were kids. The safe creaked open with a sound that made my stomach tighten. Inside were a few envelopes, some ledgers, and a small silver flash drive wrapped in cloth. I plugged it into my laptop right there on the workbench, dust falling like ash as the files loaded. The folder was labeled Lighthouse. Inside were hundreds of emails. The first one froze me in place. It was from my mother, sent 2 years ago to Ethan's old corporate account. Subject line: Clara's removal. I opened it and started to read. The messages went back and forth for months, meticulous and cold. They discussed how to phase me out of company ownership, how to adjust property transfers so that everything fell neatly into Sophie's control. My mother had called it streamlining the family line. Ethan had called it smart positioning. Scrolling further, I found one that turned my hands cold. It referenced an offshore account opened in my name using my tax information. A shell company in the Cayman Islands. The date matched the same period my digital authorization had been forged. They hadn't just taken my money. They had built an entire network of fraud behind my signature. I backed away from the bench, suddenly aware of the creaks in the floorboards, the sound of wind pushing against the windows. For a second, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I turned off the laptop and stuffed the flash drive into my pocket. Back in Boston, I called Daniel and told him what I had found. He told me to stay put until he could come over. The moment I hung up, I heard a soft scrape at my door, like something brushing against metal. I stood still, then another sound, this time sharper, the click of the lock shifting. My breath caught. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, an old lamp, but the door didn't open. After a few seconds, the noise stopped. When I finally dared to open it, the hallway was empty. Only a piece of paper lay on the floor. No envelope, no handwriting, just block letters printed in black ink. "You've gone too far." My pulse pounded in my ears. I locked the door again and called Daniel. His tone was all business now. "Someone is watching you," he said. "You need to leave Boston tonight." "I can't," I told him. "If I run, they win. Clara, this isn't about pride anymore. Whoever's behind this won't stop." I looked at the paper again. The words looked ordinary, but the intent wasn't. "No," I said quietly. "They started this story. I'm the one who'll finish it." The silence on the line stretched for a moment. Then Daniel sighed. "Fine, but we'll do it by the book. I'll alert the FBI contact. If that drive is what you say it is, it ties Evelyn and Ethan to multiple felonies." That evening, 2 agents came to Daniel's office. I handed them the flash drive, every document, every printed page. They promised to trace the offshore accounts and issue federal warrants. I left feeling both lighter and more terrified than I had in months. It didn't take long. Within 48 hours, Ethan's bail was revoked and a warrant went out for my mother's arrest. She had vanished from the hospital before anyone could question her. The news ran constant updates, flashing her photograph beside Ethan's. White-collar crime, tax evasion, fraud. Words that sounded clinical, too clean for what they had done. By the third night, exhaustion set in. I fell asleep on the couch, the television flickering silently across the room. When I woke, it was to the sound of soft knocking. For a second, I thought it was the wind again. But when I opened the door, Sophie stood there. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking. She looked smaller, like the light had gone out of her. She didn't wait to be invited in. I know everything she said, voice trembling. I know what Mom did. I motioned for her to sit, but she kept pacing. I didn't want to sign those papers. She said it was just a formality, that it would protect the company. Then she threatened to cut me off if I refused. She told me you'd already agreed. I swear I didn't know what they were doing. Her words tumbled out like confession and desperation tangled together. I studied her face, looking for the lie. But all I saw was fear. "You could have stopped it," I said quietly. She shook her head. "You don't understand. I tried. She scares me, Clara. She always has." I wanted to be angry, to tell her that fear wasn't an excuse. But I remembered what it was like to grow up under our mother's perfection, how disobedience was treated like betrayal. Sophie looked at me like a child again, waiting for permission to breathe. "What do you want from me?" I asked. She took a shaky breath. "I want to make it right. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything." For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Then I nodded slowly. "Good. It's time you told the truth." She looked down at her hands. "What happens after that?" I didn't have an answer. I glanced toward the window, where the city lights shimmered against the glass. The world outside was still moving, unaware of the storm breaking inside a single family. Tell them everything I said. Every lie, every signature. After that, maybe we both get to start over. Sophie nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. The sound of sirens echoed faintly, somewhere beyond the street, not urgent yet, just steady, the way truth approaches before it hits. The trial began, 6 months later, in a marble courthouse in downtown Boston, its steps lined with reporters and cameras waiting for the story they had turned into entertainment. Inside, the air felt heavy with perfume and tension. I sat behind the government table with Daniel and the federal prosecutors, my hands pressed together on the cold wood. When the clerk called the case, I lifted my chin and tried not to look toward the defense table. But curiosity won. Ethan sat there in a dark suit, thinner now, the arrogance gone. My mother Evelyn was beside him, her face pale, but expressionless. She looked straight ahead, not at me. The prosecution began with the documents. Transaction logs, falsified authorizations, bank transfers from my accounts. Each piece of evidence illuminated on the screen in front of the jury. Then came the emails, the ones from the flash drive my father had hidden. My mother's words echoed through the courtroom as the prosecutor read them aloud. Phrases about removing liabilities, maintaining the family line, and ensuring public image. When they reached the email about the offshore account, the silence in the room changed. It was no longer just shock. It was disgust. Daniel leaned closer, whispering, "They're finished." I nodded, but didn't smile. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, just exhaustion. When the video was played, the one of my mother and Ethan during the dinner preparations, I finally allowed myself to look at her. In the clip, she laughed, explaining how appearances mattered more than truth. I watched her shake Ethan's hand, sealing the kind of deal that destroyed families quietly. Watching her on that screen, I realized she had been planning all of this long before I ever suspected. After 4 days, the jury returned. Ethan was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, my mother to 5 for financial fraud and conspiracy. The courtroom buzzed with whispered reactions. I didn't move. When the judge's gavel fell, I felt something break loose inside me. Not triumph, but release, like an invisible weight sliding off my chest. My father didn't live to see it. He passed 3 weeks after the trial began, his heart failing quietly in his sleep. At the funeral, Sophie and I stood side by side for the first time in a year. She said nothing, only placed a white rose on the casket before walking away. I didn't stop her. Grief had turned into something beyond language. Months passed. The world moved on faster than I expected. Articles shifted from scandal to new headlines, and I found myself drifting between rebuilding and remembering. Daniel visited, often helping me navigate the final stages of the settlement. One afternoon, he brought me a letter Sophie had mailed to his office. Inside was a single page written in her neat handwriting. "I lost the only thing that mattered," she wrote. "I lost my sister. I hope someday you'll believe I didn't mean to." She had left the city, no forwarding address. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my desk drawer. Some losses aren't meant to be recovered. A year later, on a bright April morning, I drove back to Camden. The for sale sign still stood in front of the house on Lighthouse Road. The porch was overgrown with ivy, but the frame was solid, the swing still hanging where my father built it. I bought it quietly, signed the papers in a lawyer's office overlooking the bay. When I walked through the front door again, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It just felt like mine. Renovations took months. I restored every detail, from the pine floors to the glass knobs my mother once insisted were too old-fashioned. The day the last coat of paint dried, I set a small brass plaque by the entryway. Invisible Daughters Foundation. It wasn't a company or a business. It was a place for women who had lost everything to the people they trusted most. We offered legal help, financial education, and something harder to find, the belief that betrayal doesn't define you. On a rainy afternoon that September, Daniel stopped by the house. He stood by the window watching the waves break against the rocks. "You've done something good here," he said. I smiled faintly. "Maybe it's what I was supposed to do all along." He turned toward me. "Do you ever think about forgiving them?" I thought of Ethan behind bars, my mother in a quiet prison cell, Sophie somewhere far away. The question didn't sting the way it used to. I don't need forgiveness to find peace, I said. I already found it. He nodded and left soon after. When the house grew quiet again, I made tea and sat by my father's old desk. The top drawer stuck a little before sliding open. Inside, under a stack of papers, I found an envelope I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was his. For Clara, when she finally sees. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a small bank book, untouched with a balance I didn't recognize. A savings account in my name opened years ago. My father had left it there waiting for me to find it. A silent promise he'd never forgotten. Tears blurred the ink as I whispered to the empty room, "You kept your word, Dad." Outside, the storm eased. The sky opened in streaks of pink and gold, and somewhere across the bay, fireworks began to bloom. I walked out to the porch and watched them burst above the water, their reflections shimmering across the waves. They didn't feel like someone else's celebration anymore. They were mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about loss or revenge or even justice. I was thinking about beginnings, about what remains after everything burns, and how sometimes that's enough. If you've ever been told to stay quiet, remember this: silence is not weakness. Sometimes justice begins with the moment you choose to speak. Then the world finally has to listen.